Privet, Katila, Wandering Ruski desu. So, why did the current Ukrainian offensive in Zaporozhia fail, while the past Ukrainian counteroffensives in places like Kharkov and Kherson succeed? This is a question that's going to be coming up a lot in discussions between the current Western powers, within Ukraine itself, amongst war watchers, generals. Many people are going to be asking, why did this offensive fail and the other one succeeded? So in this video, I wanted to go over, based on my own research and my experience from following this war day to day, on why exactly Ukraine failed in this offensive while succeeding in the others. So as a little bit of a background, as we know, as of the making this video, which is September 6, 2023, Ukraine has been, for over 3 months now, been trying to break through Russian defensives, specifically in the Zaporozhia regions. And expectations were high. Ukraine was given a large amount, a large amount of Western equipment, from dozens of tanks, such as Leopards and Challengers, to hundreds of infantry fighting vehicles like Strykers, Bradleys, and so forth, amongst a lot of extra artillery and cluster rounds, Storm Shadows for long-range missiles, and so forth. So the West equipped, and not only that, gave them NATO training in the West to perform these operations. So they didn't get that in Kherson and Kharkov. But yet, despite getting a more bigger supply package, they still failed in Zaporozhia as of the making of this video. So they have made very little progress. So how come? So in this video, I wanted to break down why. So first, we have to discuss the prior two offensives and why they were successful before we talk about why the specific Zaporozhia offensive was a failure. So let us begin in Kharkov. So the Kharkov offensive was, without a doubt, a massive success for Ukraine. And it was less of like a grinding battle than it was a complete collapse en route of the Russian forces in that area. Russian troops basically gave very little resistance, and from September 6th, which is actually a year from today, when the counteroffensive started, to about September 12th, so in about a week's time, they were able to take key cities in the Kharkov Oblast, such as Balaklia, Kupinsk, and Izium. And basically, this was a complete collapse of Russian forces. As the Ukrainians marched, the Russians withdrew from the rest of the Kharkov Oblast and across the Oskol River. And then for about 2 or 3 weeks after that, the Ukrainian troops got caught up trying to crush the Russian troops in Liman, which they eventually did. But afterwards, after the Russian partial mobilization, the Russian troops got enough soldiers in place to be able to halt the Ukrainian offensive along the Swatovo-Kremenaya front, which is where the front line in that part of Ukraine lies to this day. So that is kind of like how the Kharkov offensive unfolded. It was a complete collapse. So why did it collapse in Kharkov but not in Zaporozhia? So what was the main reason why the Russian forces collapsed in Kharkov and the Ukrainians were able to advance so rapidly but not in Zaporozhia? As you can see, they were hoping for a repeat of that. But why didn't it happen this time? And why did it happen in Kharkov? Well, it's a simple calculus. Ukraine simply showed up to the battle and Russia didn't in Kharkov. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the forces were about evenly matched in terms of manpower, with each side, sources vary, but each side had about 200,000 active duty troops in each other's armies. However, on the day of the invasion, Ukraine declared general mobilization and became awash with volunteers and Western equipment. This swelled up their ranks by the hundreds of thousands. So that despite the massive losses that Ukraine lost during the first few weeks of the war, when things were a lot of troops got lost, got overrun, encircled, like in Mariupol, and so forth, when there was this kind of hodgepodge of territorial defense who, were just thrown into the grinder. And then when the Russians launched their Donbass offensive in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, where a ton of Ukrainian soldiers were wiped out in the grind, despite losing a ton of men, they still mobilized more than they were losing. And thus, because of that, their ranks swelled by a ton. Russia, on the other hand, did not declare any sort of mobilization. In fact, it prevented its conscripts from going into Ukraine. So it basically kept the main forces that invaded. And so at that point, it was, half a year in, 8 months in or so. Yeah, so it was about 8 months in that, they still were keeping the same forces, but they were also attritioning. Russia was also suffering losses. So, despite all that, Ukraine basically, by the time September rolled around, had a much, much larger army than the Russians did at that point. And, it depends on the estimates, but some estimates say between 3 to 4 times as much Russians. So that means that, Ukraine basically showed up, mobilized its population, and basically by that time they were able to cobble together the forces to attack. Now, not only though was the force generation bigger on the Ukrainian side, and they were able to actually move their forces in places that where they could overrun Russian lines. The front line was much larger. The front line was about 1,000 kilometers, and now it's much shorter. So Russia had to stretch its forces around, meaning that they had to give, because of their lack of force generation, they had to prioritize in some areas and basically leave some areas defenseless. Basically, Kharkov was an area where they basically left defenseless in terms of trying to put in other areas. While as for the Ukrainians, they could man the entire front and actually focus on certain areas where Russia was weak. This was given to them by Western ISR. So according to so basically basically the much anticipated and another thing that went for the Ukrainians, by the way, is the surprise factor. Nobody expected it. So Russia wasn't even putting any defenses down. So basically, Russia made a bunch of fuck-ups, and Ukraine showed up to fight. And basically, that's the main reason why they won in Kharkov, because they showed up. So the lesson from Kharkov, the Kharkov offensive, is that those who show up for the war win. And that's just kind of true. This is a true model for anything in life. If you want something, you got to show up for it. You get something if you work for it. Ukraine took the war seriously, and Russia basically did not. They actually still call it a special military operation, and not just for just aesthetic reasons. It's because they legit, when they started it, thought this was just going to be some sort of like kind of policing operation, not a full scale armed conflict. Basically the biggest European war since World War II. They weren't expecting that. They were expecting a policing operation, while Ukrainians are fighting like their lives depend on it. So, and they showed up to fight, and Russia kind of haphazardly, really didn't really care, not as much as the Ukrainians. That's kind of understudying it. An example of this is basically that force generation where Ukraine mobilized and Russia did not. And thus, when Ukraine attacked in Kharkov, Russian troops were not only caught off guard and were of low quality unit-wise, they were outnumbered. According to reports, 6 to 8 times. So basically, Ukraine concentrated the forces and were able to overrun them. And basically, no matter how much, even if you have air superiority or artillery superiority or outgun the enemy like the Russians did, you can't really fight off an army that is 6 to 8 times larger than yours, unless you're like, you go back to like caveman times or something. So, this is why there was the giant rout. They were able to overrun initial Russian defense positions because of their overwhelming numbers, and they just were able to sweep up everything else. And because Russia didn't really care to build defenses or mobilize, they were caught off guard and they paid the price for it. And so basically a big lesson of this is that, even if Russia outguns you, which, they've done, you could still win if there still comes a time in war where your courage and you showing up is what ultimately wins. Even if the other guy doesn't fight back or just doesn't really care, even a weaker opponent could defeat a guy who's apathetic, which is what Russia was. So basically, in short, they won in Kharkov because they showed up with the men and Russia did not. So if the Ukrainians were able to win in Kharkov by actually showing up, mobilizing, and overrunning Russian defenses by outnumbering them like 6 to 8 to 1, how did they win in Kherson? So the reason why the Ukrainians, let's kind of go back and look at the Kherson offensive. Now, a lot of people made the assumptions for the Zaporozhia offensive based on what happened in Kharkov and Kherson, and a lot of people think like, wow, if the Ukrainians could win there, they could win in Zaporozhia. But Kherson actually was a forewarning on what we should have expected from Ukrainian forces when they came up against Russian prepared Russian defenses. And the Kherson offensive was actually like a much kind of a repeat of what we're seeing, like a prequel to the Zaporozhia offensive. And here's why. So, despite, as mentioned, the Russians had manpower issues, but they knew that because, remember, the Kherson counteroffensive was basically blared out by Ukrainian propaganda, like, hey, this is our big offensive, we're going to drive the Russians out, we're going to defeat them. And because of that, the Russians like, okay, we have some forces in Ukraine. Let's focus them in Kherson. So the Russians actually showed up. Now, despite that, according to original estimates, they were still outnumbered about 1.5 to 2 to 1. So they were still outnumbered, but it wasn't an overwhelming like 6 to 8 to 1 like it was in Kharkov. So they showed up. Not only that, they actually prepared some defenses. So defenses in Kherson and they showed up and they actually were prepared. What happened when the Ukrainians went on the attack in August? Well, basically, kind of what we're seeing now. They took a few villages in the gray zone, but they were stopped. So basically, we're kind of seeing what we're seeing now in Zaporozhia, where when they came up against Russian resistance, they actually didn't just break through and overrun everyone. They had to grind their way through. So if they couldn't break through like in Kharkov, how did they win in Kherson? So the Kherson offensive had Russian positions in a pretty unique situation. So the entire offensive was engaged on the other side of one of the biggest rivers in Europe, the Dnieper. And in this area, the Russians only had 1 to 2 areas where Russians could supply their troops, the Novokhovka Dam and the Antonovsky Bridge. Those were the only 2 main physical routes that they could supply their troops that were fighting and defending in the Kherson offensive, or against the Ukrainians that were attacking the Kherson defenses. So despite being so these were the areas that were heavily shelled by Ukrainian forces, and yes, even the dam. So despite being able to withstand the onslaught of Ukrainian forces in Kherson, the Ukrainians, because of the unique geographic features of Kherson, were able to cut off and complicate logistics and supplies to Russian forces, almost totally, where the Russians basically had to use pontoon bridges that could have been blown up, very easily, or and such like that. So the logistic and supply situation was such that the Ukrainians only had to focus on 1 or 2 areas to completely devastate Russian supplies. And so if you could just starve the Russians out, you could force them out. So a direct attack didn't work. But because of the unique situation the Russians were in Kherson on the other side of the Dnieper, they made a decision that, hey, this is they're destroying our supplies or supply lines in such a situation that we cannot sustain it. We'll pull back voluntarily. So that's what we saw. So once we realized that the Russians withdrew from the north of Kherson in the right bank, and then the entire right bank later. And this was so unanticipated because the Ukrainians made very low progress that they did not go forward to capture the rest of Kherson that the Russians gave up because they thought it was a trap. So the Kherson offensive was a success not because Ukrainian forces routed Russian forces, but because of the particulars of the Russian situation. And because of that, they decided to pull back after Ukraine was about to knock out their only supply route. Now, this is a victory regardless of the way Ukraine achieved it, but it wasn't because of some breakthrough. It wasn't like through sheer forces that they were able to overrun Russian defenses. So it was the particulars of the Kherson battlefield that why Russia decided to pull back and basically give up Kherson to the Ukrainians, and why the Ukrainians basically, at the end of the day, actually won and achieved their objectives. So now that we know why Ukraine succeeded in their 2 previous offensives, let us look at the current situation in Zaporozhia. Now, this offensive is still technically ongoing, and maybe things will change, but it's almost certain that you will not be able to achieve their main objectives of reaching the Sea of Azov and cutting off the Russian land bridge to Crimea. Even the more limited goals that they've been starting to talk about, like reaching Tokmak, seem to be out of reach. We are 3 months in, with rain season coming soon, and all the Ukrainian units that were earmarked for this offensive having been deployed. We still have seen no significant breakthrough or capture of important objectives, with basically the offensive has been bogged down to fighting over two small Zaporozhian hammocks, Robotina and Verbova. And basically, they've barely been able to reach even the first line of defense. And basically, most of the fighting has still been in the skirmish line. And so, basically now the questions are coming up. Despite being given the training and more pieces of Western equipment than in the other offensive, so they were much more. They were. You would think they would be able to break through, despite all the assistance and training given by the West. But despite that, 3 months in, there's still been no breakthrough, not even close to a breakthrough, or even close to achieving their objectives. It's almost a total failure. And so we have to ask ourselves, why did it fail this time? So when I discuss the two previous offensives, this will give us clues on why the one in Zaporozhia failed. And a lot of Western Ukrainian assumptions came from the Russian defeats in Kharkov and Kherson, which is why they were very unprepared for this offensive in Zaporozhia, because thinking that they could repeat exactly what happened in Kharkov and Kherson, even if the situation is different. So why was it different? So the conditions of Kharkov are not there. In short, the situations have changed. The situation of Kharkov is not there. The Ukrainians did not have the elements of surprise. More importantly, the front line is smaller than it was in 2022, and Russia launched a partial mobilization of 300,000 troops. This shortening of the front and the influx of troops basically allowed the Russians to defend all positions along the front. There's not an area in the front where they're basically completely defenseless like they were in Kharkov. So they showed up and they started to fight, like we saw in Kherson. Okay, but why, if it's not like Kharkov where they basically just didn't man the front, what about Kherson? Why didn't it pan out like Kherson, where after maybe a month or two of strikes on supplies, they just gave up on their own? Well, it's not the same situation like Kherson. There isn't a magic bullet where if you bomb a bridge, that you cut off 50% of all the supplies coming in. The land bridge is, there's the land bridge. There's no one thing that will choke off the whole thing. And so there isn't a magic bullet like in Kherson that could force the Russians to give up instantly. And so because of those two reasons, and because the Russians actually prepared, and because the Ukrainians didn't have the element of surprise, and because Russia has air superiority and artillery superiority, or basically more firepower, that's why the offensive failed. This is why it was such a surprise that the Ukrainians won in Kharkov and Kherson, because of again, even if your enemy is stronger on paper, in terms of firepower, you could still overwhelm them if you show up. But the Russians showed up, and they are stronger, and they were prepared, and basically, it was a suicide operation. So that's actually why. In all the rules of war, this wasn't supposed. Unless the Russians were just not there, like they actually thought they killed 250,000 Russians, and the Russians were a bunch of unmotivated conscripts that won't fight, and that if they just blew up a few ammo depots that the Russians would give up, well, those are all false assumptions. They were right assumptions in Kharkov and Kherson, but the situation changed, and they didn't quite, at least the way they did this offensive makes it seem like they assumed the situation would have been the same, but it's not. And so because it's not the same, because Russia basically fixed the issues that, for the reasons why they lost in Kherson and Kharkov, that's why they didn't lose, or this is why Ukraine couldn't break through and couldn't force the Russians back in Zaporozhia and to achieve any of their objectives. One thing I wanted to address, because this is something that's been coming up in Ukrainian spaces, where they assume that this is a repeat of Kherson. Like, okay, listen, Russians showed up, they prepared like in Kherson, and we're seeing a struggle for the Ukrainians to break through. But eventually Ukraine broke through. Now, as I mentioned, there's not a silver bullet on why, there's not one bridge that they could cut off. The thing is that, this attrition cope that actually we're not supposed to break through. We're just here to attrit Russian forces until they just collapse and we could break through eventually. The thing is, in order to attrition the other side, if you don't have a silver bullet to just knock out all their supplies in one go, like they did in Kherson, is that you have to have the firepower superiority, and the Ukrainians do not. Russia still shoots more shells. They still have superiority over the air, not supremacy. They could still be challenged, but they have more freedom in the air to fight forces. They have a lot more better equipment, and so the thing is that in order to actually attrition, you have to have more weapons and be able to dislodge the Russians more, or the other side more than they could fire back at you. But the Ukrainians don't do that. The reason why they were able to win, it was not because they grinded through every village through raw firepower. They did it because they showed up and won and overran Russians in Kharkov, and then they blew up the main bridge that supplied the Russians in Kherson, and were able to force them away. But without that magic bullet, without a lot of force, without overwhelming the Russians with 8 times the amount of troops, with no surprise and so forth, it's basically impossible. They gave their damnness. They took a few villages, but this was a failed operation before it even started. And so because that, the assumptions they made that they could just defeat the Rush, that the same conditions from Kherson are here, or Kharkov were here, it's not. The condition has changed. And so, because of that, that's why this is not a Kherson situation. It's not like eventually they're going to blow up enough Russian pieces or depot ammo or fuel depots that they'll force the Russians to give up. That's not how it works. Maybe on a localized level, they could maybe push the Russians back from a village eventually, but besides that, they won't be able to make them withdraw from the entire area. And so that's basically the conundrum they're in. It's not, they're not the same situation, if I had to summarize it. So no, this is not a Kherson situation where even, eventually they'll force the Russians back because they just don't have the firepower or the magic, 1 or 2 bridges that they have to concentrate on. Russian supplies aren't that exposed as they are in Kherson. So this is not like a Kherson situation. So let me summarize this one more time. The Russians were prepared. They knew in advance of the Ukrainian plans on where they were going to strike. They had the manpower, and they were not restricted by the battle space. The unique conditions that Ukraine enjoyed that led to their success in Kharkov and Kherson in the fall of 2022, did not repeat themselves in summer of 2023. And, maybe we're being too harsh. Maybe the Ukrainian and its Western allies knew that the conditions changed, but the Ukrainians just had to attack, even if they knew that the Russians actually showed up. So even if they actually knew, hey, listen, the Russians actually have the manpower and actually prepared and actually, it's not going to be as easy as just cutting them off like in Kherson. If the Ukrainians kept losing, they lost Bakhmut, they slowed down after their counteroffensives in fall. And now the Russians are, the Russians have been gaining ground. And so if they want more help from the West, Ukraine had to go on this offensive. So maybe this was just the gambit. Maybe they're like, hey, maybe our assumptions are true. Maybe the Russians are going to just break. It was worth a try. They need to win. But, because if they don't win in the media sphere, if they don't gamble and try to attract more Western support, then they're going to lose, because if there's a decrease in Western support, Ukraine is pretty screwed. This is why they've been focusing so much on the kind of the media battle, and that's actually why they got all these new modern Western tanks and infantry fighting vehicles in the first place, because they showed in Kherson and Kharkov that they could win. And that's why they got such a big weapons package in January of 2023. But, and they were hoping to get a much bigger package after they won in Zaporozhia, but they didn't. So, even if they knew the conditions changed, they had to attack anyway. So that was the end of my video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and if you did enjoy it, please like this video and subscribe to my channel to see more videos like this one. So aim high, wander on, from America with Russian love.